Okay, I figure people will trickle in as they do. So I may as well just start and people can come in. So hi, I'm Julia Serrano, and I am, amongst other things, the writer of a new book, a novel called 99 Eric's, the Kat Cataclysm phone novel. It's a phone novel, not a phone number. And you'll be able to recognize it. It kind of sticks out due to the banana slug on a Hitachi. So there you go. Very memorable, hopefully, for some of you. And if you are not familiar with it, if you haven't seen me posting about it, you can find out everything that you could possibly know outside of this reading by simply going to my webpage. So you can, let's see, just Google me, Julia Serrano, and you can find this page, 99 Eric's. Here you'll find not only a description, but that's fine, you're gonna get a book reading now, so you'll know enough about the book. But there are links not only to buy it, but also free downloads. You can download the first 5 chapters for free. On this page, there are nice things people have said about it. There's all sorts of excerpts, which is awesome. You'll notice at the top of my webpage, there are social media icons. You can feel free to join any of them, but I'm pointing out the YouTube one because you may be interested to know that the first one, this is the second virtual book reading I've done. The first one is up there too, so you can find that if you liked it. It's a completely different theme, completely different readings. So if you're excited, you can read that too, okay? And you will also eventually, this one will be archived there too, although you don't need to go there and search for it because you're already watching it, unless you want to kind of create some kind of like infinite recursive loop of searching. So anyway, so yeah, so there's that. So that's great. The first one, the theme of it was on writing a book about writing a book, because this is basically, that's kind of part of what this is about. It's a tale, it's a silly, surreal, sex-positive tale of Kat Cataclysm and her adventures and or misadventures, writing a book called 99 Eric's, which is about dating, her experiences dating 99 different people named Eric. So you will learn more about that as we go along here. This one, the theme of this, because it is the eve of Bi Visibility Day, Bi Visibility Day Eve, okay, I'm coining that, if no one has. So basically, in addition to like it being a book about writing a book, another big part of the book, a theme that runs through it, has to do with Kat being a bisexual woman, an absurdist short fiction writer, where those meet, and also, so basically, the theme for this one is on bisexuals, weirdos, and book characters who are unusually queer, and I've trademarked that. Not in real life, but I put a trademark little notice next to the title. So I'm going to talk about my thoughts about kind of writing a character who is queer, but not queer in the ways that people expect her to be, and I'm going to read relevant passages about that. So, are you ready? Okay, so the initial spiel was like about 5 minutes. I'm hoping enough people are here now that I'll just start talking. I guess I should also say, for those of you who aren't familiar with my work before, I'm a trans woman, bisexual woman, who is mostly known for my nonfiction writing on queer and LGBTQIA plus, whatever letters you want to add to that, issues, and where they intersect with feminism and social justice activism. I have a lot of writings about that. Probably the one most relevant to some of the themes here, if you were to pick one up, is my second book, Excluded, Making Feminist and Queer Movements More Inclusive, which is not only a decent book, I hope, but it has the magical power of, if I hold it like that, it kind of disembodies me down here. So, okay, anyway, that was something I noticed earlier that I kind of thought was cool. There we go, that's a good look. So anyway, in this book, I talk about things like, the historic exclusion of bisexual and trans people from kind of the gay rights movement. I talk about the word queer, the umbrella word queer, and kind of why it's useful in activism. And I talk about different debates about language and strategies for activist movements, all that stuff. So if you want serious, diplomatic, thoughtful analysis, that's where you go. for this book is a little bit different. For one thing, it's fiction. But on top of that, it's intended to be humorous. I like funny stuff, and so I was trying to be funny as I wrote. And when I say humorous, not in a punching down sort of way, but in a kind of exposing the world around us, which a lot of times we get used to it, so it seems kind of normal and mundane to us. But it's really actually, when you start thinking about, kind of weird and kind of really wrong in lots of different ways. And so ever since I was a kid, I really loved absurdist humor. Like one of my earliest things, even before I really understood half the skits, I remember watching Monty Python and loving it. And then, you know, like later on, like things like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, or a lot of Kids in the Hall sketches, just anything that had like just real surreal sketches. And they really resonated with me because I just thought the world was really surreal. Like it just was just like, didn't really make sense to me. And I was thinking about it as I was writing this, and it's a, you know, it's a surreal premise to begin with, right? But I was thinking about it because, you know, there's a lot of queer literature that focuses on like overcoming obstacles and trauma, or about like revolution, and these are all important topics, and I've touched on them in my own writings. But I also think that like just the world is really surreal, and I just like the idea of kind of claiming that as like a queer project. I know usually people think of like surreal people and they think of like kind of very otherwise normal, you know, straight men or whatever, but I think that this is something for the rest of us to put our insights into. So in the last episode, in the last virtual reading, I talked about how the book just kind of came about organically. I just started writing little stories and sort of began putting them together, and they started making sense. And one of the very first things that like the only premise holding it together was this: she's dating 99 different people named Eric. And it was kind of fun because you could get like two different characters who don't really see eye to eye and put them together. And so there's a lot of fun dialogue to write that came out of that. And one of the ways in which people might not see eye to eye is with regards to queer culture. And this sort of came out of also my dating experiences in the years before writing this book. I did a lot of the personal ad dating, the dating websites. And I would come across like people like, you know, men who were fine with me being bisexual and trans, but when I would meet them, they were just like, they had no idea about queer culture. And so there would just be this kind of like barrier. And I think that a lot of people who are queer people who date straight people often kind of experience this. And so I want to like begin with like a little small reading, the opening section of a piece that really kind of gets at this. The piece is called Ethical Slut versus Confused Slut. And this is how that chapter opens up. So then you go back to the world of dating men, which superficially sounds way easier than dating women, if for no other reason than your dating pool has become significantly larger. But the problem is, you are no longer the same person that you used to be way back when you were last actively dating members of the male persuasion. Because now you have a lesbian history, or her story, I suppose, if you're going to be a stickler about it. And that doesn't simply go away just because you identify as bisexual now. And you've learned so much from your previous immersion in queer culture, far more than the superficial signifiers of queerness that everybody else thinks are so important, but you and Saussure beg to differ. We'll get to the Saussure thing in a later reading. For starters, by now you have read books by queer theorists who argue that gender is merely a social construct, much unlike ice cream. In other words, it's just a bunch of arbitrary rules and conventions that we all follow. But we don't have to. We can bend these rules, or break them. Bend and or break them. And you have also read books by sex-positive feminists who have taught you to not be ashamed of your body and desires, and that all forms of sexuality can be beautiful, provided that they are consensual. And to you, all of these ideas now seem like basic common sense. And when you date people of the female persuasion, they are generally queer, or at least queer-ish, and therefore likely already familiar with these concepts. So it will not be unusual if, over dessert on your first date, the two of you discuss sexual preferences, boundaries, kinks, enthusiastic consent before you even share a first kiss. But the men you date, by and large, have not had a lesbian her story like you have. In fact, many of them haven't even been exposed to the aforementioned queer and feminist concepts that you now take for granted. And for this reason, they will often behave in ways that seem utterly illogical to you. So that one goes on, and it describes a date with probably one of the most dude-bro-iest Erics that she dates. That piece, again, it's ethical slut versus confused slut. There are excerpts on it on that 99 Eric's webpage, so you should check that out. Or if you get the book, you can just read it there. So I should also say, once it became clear that, initially I was just like writing these things, and I'm like, okay, well, she's a bisexual woman who's dating all these Erics. I realized that kind of from an outsider's point of view, from someone who is not bi plus, someone who is maybe monosexual, as they say, they might look at it and be like, well, that's a really straight premise because it's like this woman dating this man, right? And so I kind of delighted from the idea of like leaning into that and trying to make a book that's really queer while in some superficial ways could be read as particularly straight. And I really liked it because I kind of feel like, speaking for myself, but speaking also, I think, for a lot of us, we're in queer communities, but then also we have lives in the straight world for the most part, separatists aside. And because of that, we're always kind of like living in both worlds, and some aspects of us might seem to fit in one world, but not the other, or vice versa. And so I got really into like that in itself is kind of a queerness, right? Like not really fitting in the queer world or the straight world. And also I got really into the idea of, I think when people talk about queerness, it's like there's this idea of like there are people who are queerer than other people, and in people's minds, like a lot of times people throw around things like gold star lesbian, or they throw around these kind of archetypes of like people who are supposedly the most queer. But then at the same time, I think like there's an aspect of the word queer that like literally means strange or weird. And I think sometimes some of our identities are weird to people in ways that, so I don't, as a bi woman, I wouldn't say that I'm queerer than anyone, but there's sometimes me being bi is weird to people in ways that they don't necessarily understand. And so I wanted to there are several chapters that kind of get into that. And one of the ones that I'm going to read next is this chapter called Bomb. And I called it this because I think the year before I was writing this, I read this really bad book that it was recommended to me. I'm not going to say what it is. It's a fiction book that a friend of mine liked, but it had a kind of like plot twist of like a transgender plot twist that like you didn't know who the character was trans. Of course, like I picked up on it right away, but like the point was to like use that as like this plot twist. And I thought of it as like this bomb that's supposed to blow up in the middle of the chapter, right? Or in the middle of this book. And I, of course, picked up on it. And the reason people don't pick up on these things, it's like the Crying Game. I knew she was trans, like, from the very beginning. And the first scene is, like, in a drag bar. So anyway, I kind of wanted to, like, have some fun with this. And I realized that someone who maybe is first picking up the book might think, oh, she's a straight woman who's dating straight men. And then the chapter that precedes Bomb, she mentions that she's queer, and she mentions her partner, Matilda. And so I am going to go on and read, this is the chapter Bomb. Take a quick sip of water. Adjusting the reading. Okay, so now I feel like there's this bomb just sitting here in the pages of this book. Because in the last chapter, I casually introduced the fact that I am queer, mentioned my partner Matilda, and alluded, albeit via second-person point of view, to us sharing a large assortment of infrequently used sex toys. And let's be honest, this shouldn't really be a bomb. This should just be a small info drop. Kind of like in chapter 2, when I briefly mentioned dropping out of grad school. Your reaction should be, okay, now we have learned a little more about this protagonist who we are only just now starting to get to know. In a perfect world, the whole thing would just be that, a small info drop. But we don't live in that world. Rather, we live in one with a long history of unscrupulous writers who purposefully treat their characters' sexual minority status as if it were a time bomb set off to detonate well into the story for maximum effect. Oh my god, it turns out he's gay. Holy cow, she used to be a man. Criminy, this changes everything. But here's the thing. We all know that people who are gay, transgender, or kinky, or sex workers, and so on exist. In fact, if you sit down and actually do the math, as I do, because I love math, each of these groups is far more prevalent in the US population than plumbers, stamp collectors, or people from Wyoming. Not to mention people who drop out of graduate-level linguistics programs. But if I were to mention that a character in this book falls into one of these latter categories, you probably wouldn't blink an eye. At the very most, you might be mildly surprised, but you certainly wouldn't consider it a plot twist. If, over the course of this book, I ever reveal to you that one of the characters is a time traveler, or has superpowers, or is a cloned version of another human being, then by all means, feel free to be surprised, as none of these things are known to exist in real life. If I mention that one of the Erics used to be 6'5", but has since become 5'3", you have every right to be shocked, as dramatic shrinking is not a part of the human experience. But sexual minorities are. We're a part of the fabric of life, which, if you were to touch it, would probably feel like velour, or perhaps corduroy. Anyway, unscrupulous writers craft time bombs out of their characters' sexual histories and proclivities. But not me. I am a one-woman bomb squad, and I'm here to diffuse these assumptions in the form of time bombs one by one. So here we go. Assumption number 1. Oh, you're a lesbian, but then why are you dating all these men named Eric? Okay, see, there is this word, it's called bisexual, and it's a fairly common word, one that almost everyone knows. Your next-door neighbor knows it. Your grandmother knows it. Your teenage nieces and nephews know it. And so on. But unfortunately, despite this word being very common, many people tend to be really, really bad at applying this knowledge to actual real-life situations. For instance, in describing myself as bisexual, some straight people might say, "No, I think you're a really lesbian who's just too afraid to fully own it," as if their heterosexuality somehow gives them piercing insight into the lesbian experience. And some gay people will say, "No, you're merely a heterosexual who's sexually experimenting," despite the obvious fact that they live in a "you're not gay, it's just a face" glass house themselves, and they really shouldn't be throwing stones. So to be clear, I'm bisexual. I don't limit my dating pool to members of a single gender. And if you don't have to relate to it or understand that experience in order to accept that fact. Personally, I don't understand why anyone would become a plumber, a stamp collector, or Wyomingite. Yes, that's what they're called. I looked it up. But I will never doubt these people's existences, nor do their proclivities drive me into a frenzy of consternation. Assumption number 2. But wait, if Matilda's your partner, then you must be cheating on her. With Eric's, no less. So, Matilda and I are ethically non-monogamous, or polyamorous if you prefer that term, which can mean many different things to different people. In our case, it means that we're primary partners, but we can also be romantic or sexual with other people within certain parameters that we've established together. Being ethically non-monogamous suits us, in part because we both have aspects of our sexuality that we cannot readily explore with one another. Being bisexual, I sometimes enjoy dating and fooling around with men. And, while I can be somewhat kinky at times, Matilda is more into hardcore BDSM and roleplay, which is not my thing. Like for me personally, sexual arousal and pain exist at opposite ends of the enjoy, not enjoy experiential continuum. And role-playing doesn't work for me because I'm not a good actor. I can only play the part of Kat Cataclysm. On top of that, I like making lots of jokes during sex, which isn't conducive for creating a supposedly serious scene. Assumption number 3. But Matilda must be dismayed at the prospect of you dating all these Erics. Actually, she's somewhat amused by it. She thinks it's weird, but then again, she likes the fact that I'm weird. She finds it endearing, probably because she's weird too. To be honest, Matilda is far more concerned about the fact that I'm a writer than she is about the fact that I'm dating a plethora of Erics. She worries that I will mine all of our most precious moments together and or all of the sordid and not so glamorous parts of our relationship and fashion stories out of them, as writers often do. So she made me promise not to write in depth about our relationship, which is why you will never stumble upon a book called One Matilda, at least not written by me. I should also mention that Matilda isn't even her real name. She won't let me use her real name because she is a Democratic operative. Seriously. That's what people who work for the Democratic Party call themselves. Operatives. As if they're fucking spies or some shit. And all of her co-workers, who fancy themselves as open-minded liberals, who often pat themselves on the back for being so accepting of gay people such as Matilda, would hypocritically freak out if they were to learn that she was in an ethically non-monogamous relationship with a bisexual woman who dates lots of Erics. Not to mention all the BDSM and role-playing on her part. Assumption number 4. I heard that bisexuals are really promiscuous and unable to commit into relationships, so it makes sense that you're polyamorous and seeking out lots of men named Eric. Fuck you, and fuck your stereotype trap. What's a stereotype trap, you may ask? Well, it's a logical fallacy that goes something like this. A, negative stereotype exists about minority group X. B, minority person Y seems to fit that stereotype. C, therefore, the stereotype about group X must be true. Alternatively, if you're an upstanding member of group X, then you might accuse person Y of reinforcing those stereotypes, thereby holding back the entire group. But here's the thing, though. Everybody's different. And even within relatively small minority groups, people will fall all over the maps and have all sorts of different personalities. That's why I call it a stereotype trap, because some members of the group will inevitably resemble the stereotype, but that does not make the stereotype true. So, when confronted by peddlers of stereotypes, rather than engage them in the pointless "this stereotype is true versus false" game, the most effective and emotionally rewarding response is to simply say, fuck you. Which is why I said fuck you just a moment ago in response to those stereotypes. Okay, I'm done holding your hand and walking you through this now. So that's the end of that one. Let me go back to the screen. Okay. Yes, I don't have a screen when I'm reading because I'm reading off the computer that my image is on. Let me take one more sip. Okay, so, yes, so the book. I wrote this book. Okay, I know what I want to say next. Yeah, so I wrote the Matilda character. That character is loosely based on people I know who are okay with being out in certain ways, for example, as a lesbian, maybe, but not other ways. And I also I purposely included ethical non-monogamy and talked about kink. And I wanted to kind of explore these further. I think that, let me say this. I think that my personal queer community is very diverse, including many people of different sexualities and identities. And I feel like all of us, we kind of are these different circles that make this really bizarre Venn diagram of overlapping communities. And I kind of feel like when people want to define what queer is, I kind of find what they do, there are all these overlapping circles and they kind of make this little map that includes all the circles they're in, but not the ones that they're not in. And so I kind of wanted, from Kat's point of view, I understand why sometimes you have to have terms and you have to define terms, but kind of from Kat's perspective, and I think a useful way of thinking about it is that one thing that we all share, everyone in the Venn diagram shares, is a certain amount of stigmatization. We talk about identities all the time, but the thing that we share is we have consensual sexualities that other people stigmatize. And I tried to capture this in the end of a chapter, so you're not going to know what happened before it because that would be spoilery. A hard thing when trying to figure out what chapters to read. Some of them are spoilery. This is just like a small little passage at the end of something. She's kind of mad, and this is totally coming from Kat's view on these things. And frankly, I'm also kind of pissed off about how much the gay rights movement really fucked everything up. Sexuality is a super duper diverse and complicated aspect of humanity, yet for some reason, they decided to focus on making this one single thing, aka same-sex relationships, palatable to the straight mainstream, rather than challenging sex negativity more generally. And now, here we are, living in a brave new world where many of my friends feel comfortable being out as gay, but they still often feel lots of pressure to hide the fact they're bisexual, or they wouldn't dare tell their families that they're ethically non-monogamous, or they constantly worry about losing their jobs if their employers were to discover they're kinky, or they fear winding up in jail if they're ever caught doing sex work. I don't want to live in a world that's merely safe for people to be gay. I want to live in a world where it's okay for people to be unabashed, unapologetic weirdos. That is another little passage. And I kind of wanted to do that one, not only is it kind of not only fits into the theme, there are two reasons. One, I'm writing a lot about kind of sexual stigma, kind of related to anyone whose sexuality is or can be imagined to be different or deviant and everything like that. And so that's been on my mind a lot. And so that kind of passage kind of summed up some of what's been on my mind lately. So stay tuned to like whatever 2 years from now when that book comes out. In the meantime, we're talking about this book, 99 Erics, just to remind you. I guess we're like at a little more than the halfway point. So this is the book, the 99 Erics that I'm reading from. Look for the banana slug on the vibrator cover. Okay. The other thing that was touched upon in that thing is the term weirdo. Like at the end, she wants to be an unabashed, unapologetic weirdo. And this is kind of a big part of like Kat's viewpoint and kind of evolved over time because a lot of times if you call yourself something, if you're like kind of part of someone who's marginalized in some way and you call yourself bisexual or you call yourself queer or you call yourself something, that can kind of then get defined, and then sometimes there are like these borders and everything that come up. And so she gravitates to the word weirdo because it doesn't really mean anything. Like it's not an identity. It's like just a sense of yourself as someone who doesn't fit into society, and people can be seen as weirdos for different reasons, right? And so that's her like reclaimed way of like, you know, just people who in their own way are kind of seen as outcasts or outsiders. So I want to share that because I also kind of think that that's like an interesting way of thinking about queerness, not about like, it's about having this precise identity or sexual history, but that it's just kind of to the outside world, a lot of times we're seen as different. So, finally, there's a lot of chapters in the book that touches on Kat's experiences with bisexuality and queer communities, and I wanted to end with, this is kind of a more longer chapter. It's probably my favorite, maybe my favorite chapter in the whole book, but it's my favorite that touches on these topics. It's called Posers. It already exists on the internets, on the YouTube channel. You can see it as a standalone piece. I wanted to do it here just because, again, I think it really sums up a lot of these themes, but also because the version that's on YouTube is a shortened version that I did at a reading. And so this, I'm just going to read the whole chapter, so there are parts that I really liked about it. And so this is kind of what has happened is this is Kat looking back, and she came out of a relationship with a man that went from college into graduate school. She drops out of grad school. Part of it has to do with her getting out of this relationship with this guy that wasn't going well. And so her friend from college, Gabriella, lives in the Bay Area. And so she moves out to stay with Gabriella. That comes up later in this chapter. And then there's some Bay Area specific geography here that I think is okay. I think even if you don't know the places I'm talking about, the metaphor will hopefully still ring true. So this is called Posers, and I'm going to take a sip of the beverage before we begin. These days, it's really difficult to talk about being queer because there's this popular presumption that society is now totally A-okay with same-sex relationships, which ignores the fact that this is far from the truth. Plus, most of us grew up during a time when it most definitely was not A-okay to be queer. And many people seem to have drunk the "we're just like you except for our sexual orientation" Kool-Aid, so they don't even consider the possibility that the experience of being queer might be considerably different from what straight people experience. So what is it like being queer, Kat? Some of you may now be asking. Well, I would say it's like bicycling to Alameda. But not just any old bike trip to Alameda. You are going to the west side of Alameda for some inexplicable reason. And people will argue over whether you felt the need to go to West Alameda because it's in your genes, poor parent-child dynamics, or because fetal hormones hardwired your brain that way. But you couldn't care less about these debates. All you know is that you really need to go to West Alameda, and it doesn't matter why. Plus to you, there's a real double standard at work here, as nobody would ever question you if you told them that you were bicycling to downtown Alameda instead. Now, if you were going to downtown Alameda, as everybody expects of you, you could simply bike over either the Park Street or Fruitvale bridges, both totally safe, and you'd arrive at your destination. Easy squeezy. But for West Alameda, the most direct route for you is the Posey Tube, which was built back in 1927, long before urban planners worried their pretty little heads about bike lanes. All they left you is a one-person wide pathway perched on one side of the tunnel, just above the racing cars below, with only a guardrail separating you from your impending death. The signs tell you to walk your bike, but if you did that, you'd be in the tube all day. So you precariously pedal your way across the Oakland estuary, albeit way underneath all the water. And it's outrageously loud in the tube due to the cavernous echoing of all the car and bus engines. And your eyes are peeled on the tight path that you are navigating, as one small slip-up could potentially cast you over the guardrail. So your senses are overloaded, and you are on the verge of freaking out, or screaming, or crying, or dying, or possibly some combination thereof. But you keep on going, not because you are brave or courageous, which I suppose are pretty much the same thing, but because there's no other way to West Alameda, and that's where you really need to go. But then lo and behold, you see someone approaching you from the other direction. You have to get off your bike, and they need to do the same, because the path is so narrow. And you'd think that this would be a huge inconvenience, having lost up all your momentum that you had built up. But strangely, it's not. And as you squeeze past one another, the two of you make eye contact and smile. Not the fake sorts of smiles that accompany the exchange of everyday pleasantries, but rather genuine, knowing smiles of people who share the same intense and potentially traumatic experience. And in that brief moment, the two of you make a profound human connection, unlike anything you've ever felt before. Because only a moment ago, you were both completely alone in a dark tunnel, freaking out and afraid of dying. But now you both realize that you're not really alone after all. And it's beautiful. But it's also a little sad that you had experienced all that fear and loneliness in the first place. So that's what being queer is like, at least in my estimation. Now, queer communities are an entirely different thing. That would be like if you decided to round up all the people who have ever bicycled through the Posey Tube and put them all in the same room together. At first, you would all bond over your shared experiences traversing and surviving the tunnel. But, there would be expressions of Posey Tube pride abound, and it would no doubt be a wonderful affair. But fairly shortly after that, you would all start to realize that you have nothing in common with one another, aside from this one thing. After all, you each come from different backgrounds, have different personal and political views, not to mention different bicycles. And factions would no doubt develop. For instance, between people who have bicycled through the tube in differing directions. Because let's face it, while the mainstream majority doesn't understand why anyone in their right mind would ride their bike through the Posey Tube, It is easier for them to accept people who desire to go to downtown Oakland rather than those who desire to go to West Alameda. Because why would you go to West Alameda? And people who cross the tube every day on their way to work would start to look down on the people who have only done it sporadically for occasional visits. Or the people who used to do it all the time, but no longer do so because they have since switched jobs or moved elsewhere. And of course, these former groups would probably call these latter groups something demeaning yet pithy, like posers, in order to invalidate their experiences. Even though they did have those experiences, those special moments of fear and recognition and intimacy amidst the precarious, cacophonous tunnel. And this is why, even though I have plenty of queer people in my life, I tend to avoid queer communities like the plague. But this wasn't always the case. When I first arrived at Gabriella's place in San Francisco with nothing but a backpack and a shopping bag full of whatever I could hastily pack, I was excited to finally immerse myself in all things queer. Gabriella lived in a railroad apartment that had a rotating cast of anywhere from 4 to 6 roommates at a time, all of them dykes. This was obviously back when people in their 20s who were not computer programmers making 6-figure salaries could afford to live in the Mission District. I only had to crash on Gabriella's couch for a few weeks before one of the bedrooms became available for me to move into. I forget who it was who moved out, but I'm 99% sure that it was for one of the 3 usual reasons. 1, she moved in with her partner. 2, she fled to some place with a lower cost of living, most likely Oakland or Portland. And or 3, she could no longer tolerate the chaos and drama of living with roommates who were constantly dating and often breaking up with each other's friends, ex-lovers, friends' lovers, ex-lovers' friends, and or sometimes one another. I'm going to skip that paragraph. You don't need to know that. It's a little spoilery. Anyway, there is so much to learn when you first come out as queer. I would imagine that some straight readers will be imagining that I'm talking about sexual stuff here, because gay sex is so weird. Like, what do these people do when there isn't precisely one penis and one vagina? But frankly, the sexual stuff comes pretty naturally. I mean, it's common knowledge how bodies and genitals work, and both straight and queer sex generally follows the same basic premise. You do things to pleasure your partner, and they do things to pleasure you. Nothing could be more simple. Sure, there are all sorts of advanced techniques that you can learn, but these kind of special skill sets exist for heterosexual couples as well. No, the queer learning curve isn't so much about sex as it is about culture. Because minority groups typically develop their own cultures. They have a unique history, customs, and perspectives, often shaped by the obstacles they face living in a majority-centered world. Most minorities are born into a particular culture, and so they learn everything they need to know from their families, neighbors, and so on from day one. In contrast, almost all queer people are raised in straight families and communities. So when you finally realize, oh my God, I'm queer, at the ripe old age of 23, it also strikes you that you don't know anything about being queer. Culturally, that is. Having Gabriella as a friend was immensely helpful in this regard. She introduced me to all of her queer friends, and they took me to all these awesome queer events. And over time, I learned that there's so much more to being a dyke than girl-on-girl romance and sex. For instance, there are all these bands that you're supposed to be listening to, because they are the only ones speaking directly to the lesbian experience. And there are specific haircuts, styles of dress, and even tattoos that you can sport in order to signify to people in the know that you are family. All of Gabriella's friends seemed so cool, and they were so patient and unconditionally accepting of me, at least at first. In retrospect, it was probably because they viewed me as a baby dyke, which is what they call someone who's just recently come out into the community. I probably reminded them of their younger baby dyke selves during that magical and foundational period of their own lives. So they took me under their wings, showed me the ropes, and other mixed metaphors. If I said or did anything that they perceived to be incorrect or naive, they would let it slide on account of the fact that I was simply in the throes of throwing off the chains of heteronormativity. And they weren't judgmental about my several-year-long relationship with the previous guy. They assumed that it was simply something that I had to do in order to survive in the straight world. But after numerous months of enculturation, your baby dyke status eventually fades, and you become a fully mature dyke in their eyes, one who has already seen all the ropes and knows the lay of the land. And at this point, if, rather than listening to the usual lesbian bands, who are fine, but there's only so much folk music and punk rock you can take, and serious lesbians explore more genres of music. If instead you play classic 70s prog rock records, like Close to the Edge or The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, all of your dyke roommates are going to look at you weird. Like, disdainfully weird. Because the music you're playing is not in any way sapphic, and you really ought to know better. And if you choose not to get an androgynous or asymmetrical haircut because your personal preference is for length and symmetry, or not to get a wrist star or labrist tattoo because of your trypanophobia, then some people will question your queerness, even though tattoos and haircuts have nothing to do with your sexual orientation. I mean, these are merely signifiers. And as a recently dropped out linguist, you are highly aware of the relationship that the relationship between the signifier and the signified is completely arbitrary. Or at least that's what Saussure said. So why risk getting a rainbow tattoo when 20 or 30 years from now, the signifier rainbow might mean shopping cart or macadamia nut, or the refraction of light via airborne water droplets? You never know. Your new queer friends will cut you some slack when it comes to your haircut, taste in music, and so forth. Until you meet that guy, the sweet and soft-spoken one who works at the bookstore a few blocks away. Pause. One day while there, you find a used copy of Even Cowgirls Get the Blues, and you start paging through it. And the bookstore guy asks you if you've read it before, and you say yes, back in 10th grade. It seemed so salacious and surreal, and it made quite an impression on you. But you're afraid to reread it because you're pretty sure that Sissy and the cowgirls are depicted through the male gaze, and that would totally ruin it for you. The bookstore guy replies, sadly it's true. Plus, there are all these other stereotypes in it, like the Countess and the Chink. You laugh because you totally forgot about those characters. All you remember are the lesbian cowgirls. And after a smattering of smart bantering, he mentions that he is going to an absurdist literary reading on Thursday, and would you like to come along? So of course you say yes. In the 2 days between the bookstore and the reading, you find that you're having daydreams about him, similar to the ones that you used to have of Gabriella way back during your college history classes. And after the reading, you take him out to your favorite dive bar on Valencia Street, the one with the velvet paintings and the good beer selection. And both of you order stouts, because that's what you were drinking back then, rather than IPAs. And then you have the most awesome conversation. So of course you take him home with you. And the next day, this becomes a big scandal, because your roommates saw him leave the following morning. And so they start interrogating you. And you're like, why does it matter who I sleep with? And someone asks you, well, is he at least gay? Or trans? So you respond no, he's heterosexual and cisgender, but you didn't use the word cisgender because for all you know, it wasn't even invented back then. But you did tell him that you're a lesbian and he was fine with it. And men who date lesbians have to be at least a little bit queer, don't they? And someone says date, as in more than once? And when you respond yes, that the two of you are planning to go out again in a couple of days, one of your roommates says she doesn't feel safe with a straight man coming over on a regular basis. And the second roommate seconds that emotion. And you're trying to stress how sweet this guy is. He wouldn't hurt a fly. Plus, he's a minority himself, although not a sexual minority, other than the fact that he's now dating a lesbian, which in your mind is at least somewhat sexual minority-ish, although your roommates are not buying that. And the conversation goes on for almost an hour. But about halfway through, your mind starts to wander. First, you wish Gabriella was here, because you know she would totally stick up for you. Second, it strikes you that there is this word called bisexual, and perhaps you should consider the possibility that maybe it applies to you. And third, you think about how, ever since your earliest memories, you always felt like you were different from everyone else. You were someone who never really fit in, no matter where you were or who you were with. And before today, you temporarily thought that you had finally solved that riddle. You never fit in before because you were a queer person in a straight world. Now that you have found queer community, you finally fit in. But then you realize that you don't fit into queer communities either. Maybe it's not that you're queer. Maybe your problem is that you are simply weird. Not just with regards to your sexual orientation, but like in a more systemic way. Perhaps you are someone who, for some inexplicable reason, simply needs to go to West Alameda. Nobody understands why, just ignore them and go to West Alameda. Metaphorically, of course. Because seriously, there isn't a whole lot going on in West Alameda. They don't even have a BART station. So why not try moving to downtown Oakland instead? So there you go. That is the chapter posers. Yeah, so that's everything that I had planned. I hope that I touched on kind of a lot of different topics related to queerness and bisexuality, and where they confront, mesh with, overlap with, etc., kind of the straight world. And I hope that you maybe also got a good gist for kind of Kat's personality and sense of humor. And if it appeals to you, I will remind you again, let's one last time we can do the share screen of the webpage that you will find at juliaserrano.com. And like I said, you can download the first 5 chapters for free from there. So please give it a try, tell your friends, post about it on social media, leave reviews at Goodreads and Amazon or wherever you buy it. That's really super duper helpful. And that is pretty much all I have to say. So I'm going to bid you a good evening, and I hope that you have a great Bi Visibility Day tomorrow, however you're celebrating it. And thank you very much for your time and consideration. Bye.